Hi, so welcome to Darabase Meets, a series of fireside chat style discussions, each facilitated by a member of the Darabase team, where we chat with luminaries from across a range of different industries and roles to consider how digital is evolving, and especially kind of thinking about that through the lens of augmented reality and what is increasingly being known as spatial computing. So I'm Dominic Collins, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Darabase, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Greg Ivanov, who I've known for a few years now, since I was at Jaunt XR and Greg was at Google, where he had a number of senior positions over, I think, about 12 and a half years, Greg, but we'll get into that. Greg is now a general partner of a Web3 focused VC, and also, I understand, an aspiring DJ. So I'm not sure if we'll get to that today, but welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Dom. Really great to chat to you. And yeah, it's been quite a long time since we've known each other. So good to do this.
Cool. Where are you today? Yeah, because I know you're globetrotting most of the time.
Um, I'm in Mexico City at the moment.
Mexico City. Okay, well, whatever time it is
Yeah,
there, thank you for joining us. Okay, so firstly, you've had an amazing career, a lot of which has been kind of really relevant to AR and VR and spatial and Web3, which is kind of very much the area where Darabase concentrates its efforts. So, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and kind of how you've got to where you are today in your career?
definitely. So I studied philosophy at university, which I feel like is quite a relevant starting point because my interest in technology has always been quite abstract, I would say, in the sense of less around the nitty-gritty of the tech itself, but more about the kind of the arc of where technology is headed and what form factors are going to be next and how we use tech, etc. So it's more of I guess, yeah, philosophical approach to tech, and that's what's kept me interested in all of this stuff over the years. And yeah, my first role was in media, and still find media, like traditional media, super interesting, and that led me to Google, and that was kind of, I think, like the first real kind of entry point into everything to do with platforms and ecosystems at broader scales, and spent a bit of time in the core business around ads and search. And then mobile kind of happened. Felt like it happened quite suddenly. And that was around 2014, 15, I think. So I spent a bunch of time working with developers and developing kind of our ecosystem around first mobile ads. Then I went into Google Play. And around that time, we were looking at what do we do with VR, and Cardboard had just kind of launched as initially a 20% project. And then everything to do with VR and AR kind of took off from there for me. And I spent the last, I would say, 6 years at Google looking into everything to do first with VR, and then more specifically focused on AR. And then Google Lens is a kind of as one other relevant pillar to that whole space around kind of visual, I guess, visual browser for the world, as we called it at the time, and I think probably still do to some extent.
And then you left Google, and now find yourself at 22/7. Kind of
Yeah,
what made you? I mean, you were at Google for a little
right.
while. It's often pretty tough to kind of
Yeah,
escape the gravitational pull of the Google ecosystem. So how did you manage to
yeah,
get get that velocity to escape Google and go do something else?
yeah. So I think the general sense that I had from around 2017 was that crypto is something very interesting, and in general, kind of like blockchain enabled technology and what that enables. Um, it was way too early, obviously, at that time to go into anything like full time, and I spent time in and out of blockchain stuff and crypto since about 2017. And around, let's say, 10 months ago, things aligned in a way that made more sense, and we were in discussions with a couple of ex-colleagues and friends, and managed to raise a fund that was really for us a continuation of our exploration of the next stage of the evolution of tech, and ecosystems and platforms and consumer tech, frankly, and what a kind of a permissionless platform, essentially like like blockchain, can enable. Everything to do with obviously immutability and digital ownership, and being able to build in this kind of permissionless way has been really quite an interesting dynamic, I would say, and just really curious to get into that space and really feel it out for myself, both kind of as on the investment side, but also helping out projects who are building in that space. Our thesis was that, again, this is the next evolution of consumer tech, just the way, not just the way, but similar to what mobile did for consumer internet, back in 2014. We think this is a pretty big moment. Still very early, but that is what makes it quite interesting and kind of fun to be a part of.
So, I mean, what's really interesting though is that mobile, is, you could argue, was kind of really driven by the hardware, but maybe it was really driven by the operating system or the app store or whatever. If you kind of go back to immersive and spatial, we find ourselves in the week actually that we're recording this, when Apple Vision Pro kind of officially launched and people got their first devices, and you can't move on YouTube for people sharing videos about the Apple Vision Pro. Do you think that kind of the next evolution of digital transformation and kind of how it affects our lives and how it affects marketing and so on, do you think it's going to be driven by hardware, or do you think it's going to be driven by content, platforms, etc.? Because if you kind of look back at Google, actually Cardboard was a really interesting kind of play on hardware, which maybe we can talk to, but also Google Glass, which people remember as being a bit of a forerunner in terms of wearable devices. So in this point in time, this kind of inflection point, what's going to be more important, do you think, to changing the state of digital hardware or content?
Yeah, I think my answer is going to be a bit of a cop-out, but I would say that this is just to go back to first principles and understand why does something need to exist in the first place, right? And I think if we go back to mobile, that conversation that happened 10 years ago around, if a company is raising money, they might say, we're building a mobile app to do X, Y, Z, right? Like what Uber might have said, at the time. Now we don't really speak in those terms. It's just a thing to do. It's a job to be done, right? And we don't really think about the format itself. We don't really think about whether it's hardware enabled or what kind of software runs it. It's just a thing to be done. And I think a lot of the challenges I saw at the time around AR and VR was that it was overly focused on this kind of technocratic approach of, we need this hardware to be this way, or we need more content, or whatever it is. And I think by focusing too much on the nitty-gritty of what actually enables this technology, we sometimes lose sight of like the big why of why does this need to exist and what does it actually enable. So I think it's probably a combination of both. Obviously, at times we're clearly constrained by hardware, right? Like when we're doing early prototypes for some of the Google hardware, we clearly saw that, well, if our vision for this is to be an all-day device that needs to be light, good-looking, with good optics and displays and all that kind of stuff, we are clearly constrained on the hardware side, because you could only probably wear that thing for 30 minutes or something, and I'm not really sure and again, there are trade-offs, right? So maybe you want it to be much more like what Meta is doing with their glasses, where it's more of a singular use case and it's not a kind of an all-in-one kind of thing. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it, right? Figure out what is the minimum viable kind of job to be done and go from there. And so I think keeping the end user and having this kind of very empathetic user-centric approach from the outside is super important, so that we don't fixate too much on, we need content or we need hardware to be like this, right? So I think if you remember from our days at, your days at Jaunt and then what we were doing at Google, some of the thesis we had was around, we need content, right? We need content for people to be using this thing. But actually, the problem to be solved was maybe not so much around content, but like what kind of content actually works well, or does it need to be 360, right? Like that was one insight we had as well, right? It was like,
Yeah.
does it need to be 360? It can just be 180 because, well, no one is actually looking all the way around. And so I feel like those kinds of experimental learnings are super important because they actually dictate and they go back to the user needs, and they become less about solving something very specific, but really figuring out why, like the big why behind something.
Yeah, but I completely agree. But equally, the challenge to that is that sometimes technology enables new things. So I remember when I was involved in the launch of EE, the telco, first 4G telco in the UK, and the kind of the strap line for EE was now you can, and it was all around what 4G would enable. So now you can have a video call with your grandma. Now you can shop on the bus. Now you can watch catch up TV on the go, whatever. And so I think that what do you think in terms of kind of, yes, there's the understanding of the problem statement and thinking about how technology can solve that. And that's very much kind of in the realm of what people are doing today. But in a kind of 5 to 10 year time frame, do you think that technology, whether it be hardware, software, operating systems, applications, whatever it is, do you think that it will change significantly, that it actually shifts the dial in terms of how people use technology in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the long term, again, I think it's a really valid point to bring in, because I think it all depends on time scale, right? Like right now, I think we are in this very nascent stage still. If you zoom out, 10 years from now, we clearly will have the tech, and we'll probably have these glasses that we'll wear, and that will enable a bunch of different use cases. And I think for me, again, like from a very abstract kind of philosopher point of view, I'm fascinated by this idea of actually having a persistent state where data and kind of information is attached to the real world. And I think that's a really kind of interesting primitive to think through. If you take a step back and you think about where does information live, if you think about Wikipedia, well, it's it kind of lives online. How do you access it? You go and you type something in. And what spatial computing, I guess, enables is, or one of the use cases here is to be able to have that information or that data, and you guys are very familiar with this yourselves from what you're building, be attached to the real world. And I think that as a general high-level primitive is extremely interesting and potent, and we still don't quite know the use cases that it will unlock. But from a first principles practical point of view, it just makes sense to have this persistent state where you are essentially fusing the real world with the data that is attached to that world. But now it's actually unified in one shared environment. So I think that's super interesting.
I was going to say, do you think, you kind of touching on this, but do you think that that a shift from kind of a flat screen to a spatial web will be more human with your kind of philosophy hat on, or do you think it will be more more isolating because you've got something on your face, or more of this kind of dystopian, science fiction view of the world? Because I think there seems to be two quite distinct camps. Some kind of people are very much scared of this future where, why would I want to do that, and why would I want to look like a kind of gawk, like like an idiot walking around with some kind of wearable computer on my face. But other people are going, oh, brilliant, I don't have to kind of stare down at my screen the whole time. I can actually look up, and my world can be augmented in a way that is actually very empowering and literally augmenting, and has that location context and know what plant I'm looking at, or who I'm talking to, and actually really elevate my consciousness. Which, as with your kind of philosophy and tech hat on, which way do you fall on that?
Well, I hope it definitely falls into the more kind of empowering and real world enhancing side of it. One of the, and I think we're seeing this now, one of the main, I guess, critiques that I've seen around Vision Pro is that most kind of like, I'd say, normal, non-super techie people who are meant to be the main consumer of this product, right? Like ultimately, this is meant to be more or less the first step towards the mainstream adoption, right, of something like this. So we may be fascinated by Vision Pro from our, nerdy kind of, we've been in this space for a long time and we want to see what the first Apple device looks like. But a lot of the feedback that I've seen is people are like, I don't want to be isolated in this thing. And it's isolating. And of course there's pass through, etc. So it's not completely, it's not like wearing a VR headset when you're completely, locked up from the real world. And we've always called it, at least at Google, we called it a continuum. It wasn't going to be AR, VR, it's a spectrum. And ultimately, yes, there will be moments when you are in this fully immersive environment, and then other moments when it's really just a layer on top of the real world. I hope it lands more as a layer on top of the real world. Obviously, again, going back to technological constraints, it looks what it looks like now because of all those constraints, and it does look a bit more like you're in this kind of weird kind of like headspace, quite literally. And I think that in general, my view is optimistic on this. Like I hope it does, again, like it does elevate our consciousness. It does kind of improve our daily lives in a way that helps us connect and be more present in the moment rather than be in this synthetic environment kind of on your own.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that, it's interesting that it's called a Vision Pro. For me, this is a creator tool. It is actually probably for the nerds and for the people in the bubble a little bit, because those are the people who are, let's be honest, going to spend $3,500 on one of these things because they want to learn and play, and they see that there's a long-term horizon as to how this thing is going to play out over time, and they want to learn now how they can start to kind of, as an extension of mobile, because as we always say at Darabase, there's 1.6 billion or 2 billion people already doing AR every month on their mobile. So this is an extension of that. And I think what's really interesting, you bring up like the Meta Ray-Bans, and then you've got kind of the Vision Pros, and it feels that these two things are kind of just, and then obviously the Quest and so on are just coming together, and hopefully they'll meet somewhere great in the middle. So how do you kind of see Web3 fitting into this? So you've spoken about leaving Google and always being interested in kind of the crypto and the blockchain and so on. Do you think that they're quite kind of parallel tracks right now, or that they're converging, or because people think about them quite separately in terms of this being the future of digital, this being the future of the web? How do you see those things conflating?
I think it's a natural progression, the idea of digital ownership that is immutable and that is not obviously controlled by any centralized party is an interesting primitive. With something like spatial computing and AR, we've already seen experimentations around NFTs that are kind of placed out in the real world. It's still quite early. I think there's a lot of potential, obviously, around digital property rights and everything that you guys are doing. There's a lot of potential around creating new content primitives that are real world, whether they're real world art installations or they're new kinds of content primitives that are yet to be fully unlocked through this kind of through this ecosystem. One thing that I always found really interesting is this idea of liberating content kind of into the real world, and one of the things we were talking to with Spotify back in the day was, how can you create a value add layer of experience to what Spotify does, right? So for example, you could create a kind of a gamified or just an interesting way of experiencing a city through the lens of music, right? So being able to go around London and experience different artists, different music, artwork, album artwork, based on different locations. That's obviously, Spotify, in terms of like what they do, that might make sense from a kind of an end consumer point of view. But you could also see that being unlocked through Web3 and through individual creators creating their own kind of content experiences, being able to monetize that. I think just when you layer on this idea of digital ownership onto the real world that can be monetized and can have a create new kinds of incentives for creators and for users, I think it's just really interesting. I think it unlocks a bunch of interesting use cases that really fuse the real world with digital in a way that's meaningful and not just gimmicky.
Yeah, I think I see the real world as kind of the sticky brick, as it were, in between the two. Um, in that, as you say, augmented reality, spatial web, whatever you want to call it, is increasingly about augmenting the real world, layering digital content on the real world. And actually, one of the trends in Web3 and blockchain that I'm excited about, and which obviously Darabase is involved in, is this tokenization and fractionalization of real world assets. And yes, that could be a barrel of whiskey, or it could be an artwork, or whatever. But equally, the biggest asset class in the world is property. And so, actually thinking about from a Web3 perspective how property or property rights can be kind of tokenized and leased and traded and monetized and valued, and then thinking on the other side of the coin about how those, that can be done through digital content augmentation, etc. That feels to me like a really strong bond between those two trends.
Agreed. And I think from a purely crypto Web3 point of view, and there's a lot of nonsense in Web3, as you know, there's a lot of very clever and sometimes not very clever Ponzi's, and it is a natural, I think, trend for any kind of like new tech where there's kind of money to be made. However, there's a very strong sense in which real world assets is one of the real main use cases that blockchain has unlocked and was in a way designed to unlock.
Yeah.
So this is huge. I think what's happening right now with everything to do with obviously real world assets and bringing a bunch of them on chain, everything from T-bills to real estate to there's a broad spectrum. There's a real reason for why that makes sense, and it's in Web3 we want to distinguish between narrative, which is just like what is hot at the moment and what makes money. Like I would argue that those early metaverse days of 2020, like 2021, were more of a narrative than a use case because hardly anyone was using it, and that wasn't really a practical reason for users to be interacting in those worlds. It was slow. It was not very good from a user experience point of view. Not really great. Narrative and use case. And use case is the real thing. It's like, okay, why does this actually exist and why does it need to exist on blockchain? And I think real world assets are really a great example of something that is a true use case. And I think it's a pretty exciting time for what you guys are doing and in general for real world assets.
So last kind of thought and set of questions is you probably speak more languages than most people I know, Greg. You've always had a pretty international kind of view of the world. Do you, in your kind of current role and the experience today, are you seeing regional differences in the way that people are thinking about some of the things that we're talking about? Are you seeing a different sentiment in Europe versus North America versus Asia? Just kind of because it feels that we all, to a greater or lesser degree, kind of sit in our own bubbles. Some of us have more kind of a more global view of the world based on where we're trading and so on. But it does feel that right now it's quite different in different areas of the world. It's kind of interested in your thoughts on that.
Honestly, I think the main real distinction and the main cultural difference is really only between kind of Asia and the rest of the world. I feel like in Asia, if you look at something like gaming, it's very different. Like the kind of like the something as simple as kind of pay to win is a big thing in Asia in terms of gaming, and that's just very different to how we think about people are prepared to pay extra money to win the game, right? And it's like that gaming mindset is very different in that part of the world, and that's not just about gaming. It's just in general, I think, approach to tech and kind of the willingness to experiment, the willingness to if you look at some of the early AR VR devices like Unreal, right? I think they were very early in with telcos in Asia. Like those telcos were very much prepared to kind of range those devices and really kind of bring them to the market. So I think like Asia is standalone in terms of how they think about this tech and the risk they're prepared to take. The rest of the world, I feel, is a bit more blended. In general, I feel like we speak to teams all over the world. Sometimes we don't even know where they are before we get on a call. And there's more of a running thread, I think, in this sector of technology where there's a lot of commonality between how people think and, you know, the tech they're playing with and their general kind of attitude towards it. So I don't see that being that much difference in that regard. But yeah, I would say Asia is definitely something that kind of stands out in terms of their willingness to experiment.
Okay. And last question, what do you think is going to be the biggest driver of change in our digital lives in the kind of medium to long term? Maybe something we've already touched on, but and then what are you personally most excited about?
Yeah, I think, like, honestly, I think one of the things that I'm most excited about right now is some of the experiments in social. We are seeing really first practical iterations that are meaningful in blockchain-enabled social platforms. So platforms like Farcaster and these notions of kind of headless marketplaces, a social protocol that is blockchain-based that enables other projects to build on top and create products where users already are, that is not owned by any centralized entity. For the first time, I think we're seeing actually pretty good UX and UI in those products and seeing really cool first iterations of, you know, of these products and people actually using them. And that I think is really exciting because that sense of composability where you have an underlying protocol that anyone can build on top and build different kinds of applications on top of user-owned data is super interesting, both from I guess, kind of a philosophical point of view where it's just not really owned by anyone, it's user-owned and it can't really go down, it's fully distributed, but also from what you can build on top. I think composability in general is one extremely powerful primitive that I'm super excited about because it's still super early and we're seeing this with blockchain now and kind of the end consumer applications that are coming online. And then in general, I think from an AR VR point of view, I'm just, you know, I'm curious where kind of the next iteration of hardware takes us and when we get to the place of a Vision Pro or a similar kind of device that looks something that you might actually want to wear, you know, day to day and it being useful. So that, yeah, I think that's a bit further away, but those are the two things I'm quite excited about.
Cool. Okay, well, Greg, it's been delightful to see you again. Thanks so much for your time and for your insights. And yeah, have a great rest of the day and I'll no doubt speak to you soon.
Thanks, Dominic. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Greg.